somewhere in the warm water north of Cuba, on the 27th of October 1962, a Soviet submarine was being hunted. She was called B-59, an ordinary diesel boat built to hide in cold seas, and she was now trapped in the tropics, deep, blind, and running out of air. American destroyers overhead were dropping small explosive charges into the water beside her, one after another, to force her up. Inside the hull, the temperature had climbed past anything the crew was built for. The batteries were failing, and the men had not heard a clear word from Moscow in days. They did not know whether, up there in the sunlight they could not see, the war had already begun. And aboard that submarine was a single nuclear torpedo, and so the story goes, a captain who decided the moment had come to use it. You have probably heard how this ends. It has become one of the great parables of the nuclear age, told every October, printed on posters, narrated in that hushed voice we save for near misses. The captain, half mad with heat and certain that war had started, orders the nuclear torpedo made ready. His political officer agrees, and one single officer aboard says no. He argues, he refuses, he holds out against the other two, and because he does, the torpedo is never fired, the destroyers are never vaporized, the exchange that would have followed never happens. One man, we are told, saved the world. His name was Vasili Arkhipov, and the West did not even learn it until 2002, when a historian stood up at a conference in Havana and said, in as many words, that a Soviet naval officer nobody had heard of had once saved us all. It is a magnificent story, and I am not going to tell you it is false. Most of it is probably true, but I want to do something more useful with it than repeat it, because told the usual way, it teaches us exactly the wrong lesson. And the wrong lesson about this, of all subjects, is dangerous. The usual telling makes it a story about a man, a brave man, a calm man, the right man in the right place. And the comfort we take from it is the comfort of character. Thank God he was there. But if the only thing standing between us and a nuclear war was that one unusually steady human being happened to be in that one room on that one night, then the honest response is not gratitude. It is terror. Because you cannot build a civilization's survival on the hope that the right person is always aboard. So I want to ask a colder question than who was brave. I want to ask, how many people had to say yes? Let me state the argument of this film plainly, before we go any further, because everything else hangs on it. A weapon like that torpedo sits at the end of a chain of human decisions. Someone has to decide to arm it. Someone has to decide to aim it. Someone has to decide to fire. And the safety of the whole terrible apparatus depends on one structural fact that has nothing to do with anyone's courage: the number of independent people who must agree before it goes off. If a launch needs one yes, it is exactly as safe as the single most frightened, most deceived, most exhausted person in the chain. If it needs two independent yeses, then any one of them can stop it. If it needs three, safer still. The safeguard is not a hero, it is a count. So the real question about B-59 is not whether Arkhipov was a good man. It is this: how many independent noes did that submarine contain, and was that number there by design or by accident? To answer it, we have to leave the legend for a moment and look at the machinery, starting with why a submarine like B-59 was carrying a nuclear weapon toward Cuba at all. In the autumn of 1962, the Soviet Union launched Operation Anadyr, the vast, secret movement of men and missiles to Cuba that set off the whole crisis. Part of that operation was a small flotilla of 4 submarines, Foxtrot-class boats, ordinary long-range diesel-electric submarines, sent across the Atlantic toward the island. Their numbers were B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130. And each of the 4 carried, among its ordinary torpedoes, one special weapon: a single nuclear torpedo, a warhead of about 10 kilotons, something like 2/3 of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, packed into a torpedo meant to break an American carrier group in half. 4 submarines, 4 nuclear warheads, sent quietly into the most dangerous fortnight of the 20th century. And they were sent almost blind. These were not the sleek nuclear submarines of the films. They were diesel boats that had to come near the surface to charge their batteries, built for the North Atlantic and now sweating in Caribbean water they were never designed for. Their communications with Moscow were poor and intermittent. When the United States declared its naval quarantine around Cuba and flooded the sea with anti-submarine forces, the 4 boats found themselves hunted through waters they barely understood, by an enemy who did not know they were carrying nuclear weapons, and who was following a peacetime signaling procedure that the Soviets had never been told about. That last detail matters more than any other, so hold on to it. The Americans, on finding a submarine, would drop small practice depth charges, harmless signaling grenades, meaning, "We have found you, come up." To a captain sealed inside a hot steel tube, cut off from the world, those same explosions could mean only one thing: not come up, war. Now, almost everything we think we know about the next few minutes inside B-59 comes from a single source. And I have to be honest with you about that, because the honesty is part of the argument. Our vivid account of the near launch, the overheated captain, the shouted order, the vote, comes chiefly from one man, Vadim Orlov, who ran the radio intercept team aboard the boat, and who told the story decades later. It is a gripping account, and it may well be accurate. But it is one witness, remembering across 40 years, and other Soviet submariners who were there in that flotilla later doubted parts of it, doubted, in particular, whether the captain had really gone as far as the legend says. So when I tell you what happened next, hear the quotation marks around it. This is the story we have. It is not a verified transcript, and strangely, that uncertainty will turn out to strengthen the point rather than weaken it. Here is the story we have. On the afternoon of the 27th, with the depth charges hammering the hull and the air turning poisonous, Captain Valentin Savitsky lost his composure. Believing the war had already started up above, he ordered the nuclear torpedo readied, and in the version that has come down to us, shouted that they would die but they would sink them all, that they would not disgrace the Navy. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, is said to have agreed, and Arkhipov refused. But why did Arkhipov's refusal matter? A political officer's agreement, a captain's order, and one objecting officer. Why should the objection win? And here we reach the fact that the legend rushes past, the fact that is the true hinge of the whole night and the true subject of this film. Arkhipov was not just another officer on that boat, and it is not because of his courage. It is because of his job. Vasili Arkhipov was the chief of staff of the entire submarine brigade, all 4 boats, and he happened to be riding aboard B-59 as the senior officer present. That gave him an authority the ordinary captain of a single submarine did not have. In the account we have, launching that torpedo needed the agreement not of one man but of the senior officers aboard together, and because the brigade's second-in-command was physically sitting in that hull, his was a consent that had to be given and could therefore be withheld. B-59, alone of the 4 boats, carried an extra independent no, not because the Navy had wisely designed it that way, because of who happened to be aboard. Stop and look at the shape that makes, because the shape is the entire point, and the best way to see it is on a map. Picture the 4 submarines crossing the Atlantic in the autumn of 1962. 4 boats, leaving the cold water off northern Russia, running south and west across the ocean toward the warm approaches to Cuba and the American quarantine line drawn in the sea. 4 identical hulls, 4 identical nuclear torpedoes, 4 captains each capable, in a moment of blind panic, of believing the war had begun. On 3 of those boats, B-4, B-36, and B-130, the chain of decision was whatever the ordinary rules made it. On one of them, B-59, and only because the brigade staff officer had chosen that particular hull to travel in, the chain was 1 link longer. 1 more independent person who had to say yes, 1 more person who could say no. And this was not a hypothetical asymmetry, a difference that only existed on paper. All 4 boats were hunted for real and hunted hard. Over those same days, the American anti-submarine forces ran the flotilla down 1 boat at a time. B-130 lost the use of her diesels and had to wallow up to the surface almost helpless. B-36 was tracked and forced up too. Boat after boat was driven to the same edge B-59 reached, cut off, overheated, hammered from above, each with its own frightened captain and its own single nuclear torpedo. And on 3 of those 4 hulls, there was no brigade chief of staff aboard to make an extra consent necessary. We remember B-59 because of what is said to have happened in her control room. But there were 3 other control rooms in the same ocean that week, each one link shorter in the chain, and about what nearly happened inside them we know very little indeed. The map does not show you a hero. It shows you an asymmetry. 3 boats with 1 safety count and a 4th, by pure accident of paperwork, with a better one. And that is where the famous story quietly betrays us, because it spends all its wonder on the man and none of it on the number. We say, thank God Arkhipov was aboard, and we should. But listen to what that sentence actually admits. It admits that if the brigade's chief of staff had chosen to travel aboard B-36 instead, then B-59 that afternoon would have been an ordinary boat, with an ordinary chain of command, and the captain's order might have met no equal authority strong enough to stop it. The very same courage in a lower-ranking man might not have counted because it might not have been a required consent. The thing that stopped the torpedo was not only that a steady man said no. It was that his no was structurally necessary, that the system on that 1 boat happened to require his agreement. Change the seating chart and you change the number of noes, and if you change the number of noes, you may change the history of the world. So let me now say the mechanic of this film exactly, because we are ready for it. The safety of any weapon that could end a great many lives is not, in the end, a matter of the character of the people near it. It is a matter of how many independent people are structurally required to agree before it can be used, and of whether that number was put there on purpose. A brave objector only saves you if the design makes his objection count. A wise, reluctant officer with no formal power to refuse is a bystander to the launch, not a brake on it. The question you must ask of any doomsday machine, then, is not, are good people in charge? It is, how many independent vetoes are built into this, and did someone build them, or did they arrive by luck? One is a safeguard. The other is a coin toss you happen to win. Now I have to give you the fact that most threatens this whole argument, and as always, I would rather hand it to you myself than have you find it later and feel cheated. I've been talking about the number of required noes as if we knew it precisely, as if there were a rulebook that said, in black and white, that firing that torpedo needed 3 officers or 2 officers or the brigade staff man's consent. We do not have that rulebook. The 3 must agree version of the night is itself part of the story we inherited, and historians have never been able to confirm it as hard Soviet doctrine. It is entirely possible that no formal rule required Arkhipov's consent at all, and that his refusal carried the day simply because he outranked everyone aboard and forced the issue by sheer authority and nerve. You would think that admission dissolves my argument. It does the opposite, follow it through. Because look at the 2 possibilities and see that they lead to the same place. Either there really was a rule, some requirement that more than 1 senior officer consent before that warhead could be used, in which case the world was saved on the 27th of October by a designed veto, a deliberate extra no built into the chain, and the lesson is, build those, they work, they are the thing that saved you. Or there was no such rule, and the torpedo was stopped only because one exceptionally senior, exceptionally steady man happened to be aboard the 1 boat, and happened to have the standing to overrule a panicking captain, in which case the world was saved not by a safeguard at all, but by a coincidence of rank and temperament and travel arrangements. And that is the more frightening reading, not the more comforting one. Either the veto was real, and we should be building more of them, or it was luck, and we have no idea how close the other 3 boats came. There is no version of this story in which the count did not matter. This is the moment to turn the beautiful legend into something more useful than a legend, which is an instrument for measuring. The story of the man who saved the world is told to make us feel that we were, in the end, all right, that goodness was present when it was needed. Used that way, it is a lullaby. But turn it over, and the very same facts become a gauge you can lay against any nuclear system, then or now. Do not ask it whether the people are good. Ask it the cold question: how many independent human noes stand between a single frightened man and the weapon? On B-59, if the story is true, the answer was 2, and only by accident. On her 3 sister boats, it may have been fewer. And once you are counting instead of admiring, you cannot stop, because the same gauge swings round to face every silo and every submarine and every early warning desk that has existed since, including the ones operating tonight. And when you do lay the gauge against real systems, you find that the good ones learned exactly this lesson and stopped trusting to character. The safeguards that serious nuclear powers eventually built are not appeals to virtue, they are appeals to arithmetic. The 2-man rule, under which no single person can arm or launch a weapon alone, so that any one of the pair is a veto. Physical locks and codes held by separate authorities, so that consent has to arrive from more than one direction at once. The whole grim architecture of nuclear command is, at its best, a machine for raising the number of independent yeses a launch requires, precisely so that no single overheated, deceived, or broken human being can end the world by himself. Arkhipov is celebrated as the exception who rose to the occasion. The better reading is that a system should never need anyone to rise to the occasion, because it should never place the occasion in one man's hands. But notice the hidden word in that sentence, because it is the word the whole safeguard turns on: independent. A count of noes only protects you if each no is genuinely free to be said. 2 officers who must both agree are worth nothing if the second will always defer to the first, if rank or fear or the sheer momentum of a panicking commander means the junior man's consent is a formality. Then you do not have 2 vetoes. You have 1 veto and 1 echo. This is the harder truth hiding underneath the arithmetic. What saved B-59, if anything did, was not merely that a second consent was needed, but that the man giving or withholding it was senior enough and steady enough to actually withhold it against the pressure in that room. The number matters, but the number is only real if the people counted in it can each truly say no. And that is far harder to build into a machine than a lock. There is one more piece of the legend I have to correct, gently, because it shows how the hero story quietly inflates itself even in the details. We often say that Arkhipov not only stopped the torpedo, but then talked the captain into surfacing, into coming up peacefully to face the American ships. It makes a cleaner story. The wise officer, having refused the weapon, now leads the boat calmly back into the light. But the most careful recent history of the crisis, by Serhii Plokhy, points to a plainer reason B-59 surfaced when she did. Her batteries were nearly dead. A diesel submarine with exhausted batteries has no choice. She must come up to run her engines and charge, or she stops being a submarine and becomes a coffin. The boat surfaced because the physics of the boat left no alternative. Refusing to fire the torpedo and coming up to the surface were 2 separate things, and only the first was a decision. Every time we merge them, we make the man a little larger and the machinery a little smaller. And it is the machinery we most need to understand. The rest of that afternoon was, mercifully, an anticlimax, which is what survival usually looks like from the inside. B-59 came up into the daylight and the sea full of American ships. The torpedo stayed in its tube. The Americans, still not knowing what the boat carried, watched her charge her batteries, and eventually let her turn for home. No shot was fired. No carrier burned. The crisis above the water moved over the following day toward its resolution, and the 4 submarines withdrew across the Atlantic, carrying their unused warheads back into the cold. And here is the strangest thing about how we remember all of it. The Cuban Missile Crisis is taught as a story of statesmen. The young president and the ex-com around a table, the letters between Kennedy and K. Khrushchev, the quarantine line, the deal, the blink. That is the version with the famous photographs. And in that version, the world was pulled back from the edge in oak-paneled rooms by men who knew exactly what they were doing. But the closest the whole confrontation may actually have come to nuclear war was not in any of those rooms. It was 100 meters underwater, in a boat nobody in Washington could even find, decided by men no head of state had ever heard of, on information nobody at the top possessed. The men who had nearly died in the heat told almost no one. For 40 years, the whole episode sat in the dark, and the world congratulated its leaders for a rescue that may really have hinged on who happened to be aboard one submarine. Only in 2002 did the story climb into the light, and with it, the name of the officer who had said no. Which brings me to 2 historians, because I promised you I would not settle this by assertion, and both of them see this night more clearly than the poster version, in opposite ways. The first is Serhii Plokhy, whose history of the crisis, nuclear folly, takes the submarine near miss with complete seriousness. He does not wave it away. He treats those hours off Cuba as one of the genuine hinges on which the whole confrontation turned, a place where the crisis very nearly slipped its leash entirely. And he is right, and I have leaned on his care throughout, especially about the batteries. Plokhy establishes the danger. What he does not do, and does not try to do, is reduce it to a single heroic act. He leaves the machinery visible, which sets up the objection that could sink everything I have said. That objection comes from Michael Dobbs, whose book 1 Minute to Midnight was the first serious history to put the B-59 confrontation on the page at all, and who has since become one of the most careful skeptics of the legend it helped create. Dobbs points out correctly how thin the evidence really is, how much rests on that single account, how uncertain we are that the captain ever truly ordered a launch, how the tidy drama of the vote may be a reconstruction laid over a much murkier reality. We cannot, he warns, crown any one man the savior of the world on evidence this fragile. And that looks like the end of my film. If we cannot even be sure the vote happened as told, how can I build an argument on the count of the noes? But watch what Dobbs's objection actually does, because it does not knock the argument down. It removes the last thing standing in its way. Because if Dobbs is right, if the heroic vote is too fragile a thing to build a legend on, then the legend was never the point, and we should stop trying to build one. The man dissolves under scrutiny. Fine. What does not dissolve is the structural question, and it only gets sharper. Whether or not the vote happened exactly as Orlov told it, 4 Soviet submarines carried nuclear warheads into that sea, each at the end of a human chain, and we still cannot say for certain how many independent noes stood in any of those chains. Dobbs's skepticism does not rescue us. It strips away the comforting story and leaves us staring at the thing underneath, which is that the survival of the world may have rested on an accident of rank aboard one boat, and on nobody's design at all. His objection, meant to deflate the hero, inflates the danger. He has not saved us from the argument. He has handed us its hardest form. So here is the verdict, as plainly as I can put it. Vasili Arkhipov may well have been a brave and steady man, and if the story is even half true, we owe him something no ceremony can repay. But he is remembered as the man who saved the world, and that is precisely the wrong monument, because it teaches us to wait for the right man instead of building the right rule. The truth of that afternoon is not that goodness happened to be present. It is that the number of people required to say no happened on one boat by luck to be one higher than on the others, and that we cannot even be certain it was a rule rather than a coincidence. A civilization that survives on coincidences of that kind has not been kept safe. It has been let off. The lesson of B-59 is not thank God he was aboard. It is, never again build a weapon whose safety depends on who is aboard. Count the noes. Put them there on purpose.